from whence there can be graduated, fit and proper people, whose effort would be in the direction of the subconscious mental mechanism of the child, or even the adult." End quote. This hypnotist proceeds, quote, "Between the academician, whose speciality is an inconsequential cobweb, the medical man who has got it into his head that he is the logical foster father for psychonomical matters, and the blatant professor who deals with monkey tricks on a few somnambules on the musical stage, you are allowing to go unrecognized one of the most potent factors of mental development." End quote. Am I? I have not the least idea what this gentleman means, but I can assure him that he is wrong. I can make more sense out of the remarks of another correspondent, who, utterly despising the things of the mind, compares a certain class of young men to a halfpenny bloater with the row out, and asserts that he himself got out of the groove by dint of having to unload 10 tons of coal in 3 hours and a half every day during several years. This is interesting and it is constructive, but it is just a little beside the point. A lady whose optimism is indicated by her pseudonym Espérance put her finger on the spot, or rather on one of the spots, in a very sensible letter. "It appears to me," she says, "that the great cause of mental inefficiency is lack of concentration, perhaps especially in the case of women. I can trace my chief failures to this cause. Concentration is a talent. It may be in a measure cultivated, but it needs to be inborn. The greater number of us are in a state of semi-slumber, with minds which are only exerted to 1/2 of their capability. I thoroughly agree that inability to concentrate is one of the chief symptoms of the mental machine being out of condition. Espérance's suggested cure is rather drastic. She says, "Perhaps one of the best cures for mental sedentariness is arithmetic, for there is nothing else which requires greater power of concentration." Perhaps arithmetic might be an effective cure, but it is not a practical cure, because no one, nor scarcely anyone, would practice it. I cannot imagine the plain man who, having a couple of hours to spare of a night, and having also the sincere desire, but not the willpower to improve his taste and knowledge, would deliberately sit down and work sums by way of preliminary mental calisthenics. As Ibsen's puppet said, people don't do these things. Why do they not? The answer is simply because they won't. Simply because human nature will not run to it. Espérance's suggestion of learning poetry is slightly better. Certainly the best letter I have had is from Miss H.D. She says, "This idea, to avoid the reproach of living and dying without ever really knowing anything about anything, came to me of itself from somewhere when I was a small girl. And looking back, I fancy that the thought itself spurred me to do something in this world, to get into line with people who did things, people who painted pictures, wrote books, built bridges, or did something beyond the ordinary. This only has seemed to me all my life since worthwhile." Here I must interject that such a statement is somewhat sweeping. In fact, it sweeps a whole lot of fine and legitimate ambitions straight into the rubbish heap of the not worthwhile. I think the writer would wish to modify it. She continues, "And when the day comes in which I have not done some serious reading, however small the measure, or some writing, or I have been too sad or dull to notice the brightness of color of the sun, of grass and flowers, of the sea, or the moonlight on the water, I think the day ill spent. So I must think the incentive to do a little each day beyond the ordinary towards the real culture of the mind is the beginning of the cure of mental inefficiency. This is very ingenious and good. Further, the day comes when the mental habit has become a part of our life and we value mental work for the work's sake. But I am not sure about that. For myself, I have never valued work for its own sake, and I never shall. And I only value such mental work for the more full and more intense consciousness of being alive which it gives me. Miss H.D.'s remedies are vague. As to lack of willpower, the first step is to realize your weakness. The next step is to have ordinary shame that you are defective. I gravely doubt if these steps would lead to anything definite. Nor is this very helpful. I would advise reading, observing, writing. I would advise the use of every sense and every faculty by which we at last learn the sacredness of life. This is begging the question. If people, by merely wishing to do so, could regularly and seriously read, observe, write, and use every faculty and sense, there would be very little mental inefficiency. I see that I shall be driven to construct a program out of my own bitter and ridiculous experiences. The cure. But tasks in hours of insight willed can be through hours of gloom fulfilled. The above lines from Matthew Arnold are quoted by one of my very numerous correspondents to support a certain optimism in this matter of a systematic attempt to improve the mind. They form part of a beautiful and inspiring poem, but I gravely fear that they run counter to the vast mass of earthly experience. More often than not, I have found that a task willed in some hour of insight cannot be fulfilled through hours of gloom. No, no, and no. To will is easy. It needs but the momentary bright contagion of a stronger spirit than one's own. To fulfill, morning after morning or evening after evening, through months and years, this is the very Dickens, and there is not one of mine readers that will not agree with me. Yet, such is the elastic quality of human nature that most of my correspondents are quite ready to ignore the sad fact, and to demand at once, "What shall we will? Tell us what we must will." Some seem to think that they have solved the difficulty when they have advocated certain systems of memory and mind training. Such systems may be in themselves useful or useless. The evidence furnished to me is contradictory, but were they perfect systems, a man cannot be intellectually born again merely by joining a memory class. The best system depends utterly on the man's power of resolution. And what really counts is not the system, but the spirit in which the man handles it. Now, the proper spirit can only be induced by a careful consideration and realization of the man's conditions, the limitations of his temperament, the strengths of adverse influences, and the lessons of his past. Let me take an average case. Let me take your case, O man or woman of 30, living in comfort, with some cares and some responsibilities, and some pretty hard daily work, but not too much of any. The question of mental efficiency is in the air. It interests you. It touches you nearly. Your conscience tells you that your mind is less active and less informed than it might be. You suddenly spring up from the garden seat and you say to yourself that you will take your mind in hand and do something with it. Wait a moment. Be so good as to sink back into that garden seat and clutch that tennis racket a little longer. You have had these hours of insight before, you know. You have not arrived at the age of 30 without having tried to carry out noble resolutions and failed. What precautions are you going to take against failure this time? For your will is probably no stronger now than it was aforetime. You have admitted and accepted failure in the past. And no wound is more cruel to the spirit of resolve than that dealt by failure. You fancy the wound closed, but just at the critical moment, it may reopen and mortally bleed you. What are your precautions? Have you thought of them? No, you have not. I have not the pleasure of your acquaintance. But I know you because I know myself. Your failure in the past was due to one or more of 3 causes. And the first was that you undertook too much at the beginning. You started off with a magnificent program. You were something of an expert in physical exercises. You would be ashamed not to be in these physical days. And so you would never attempt a hurdle race or an uninterrupted hour's club whirling without some preparation. The analogy between the body and the mind ought to have struck you. This time, please do not form an elaborate program. Do not form any program. Simply content yourself with a preliminary canter, a ridiculously easy preliminary canter. For example, and I give this merely as an example, you might say to yourself, within 1 month from this date, I will read twice Herbert Spencer's little book on education, 6pence, and will make notes in pencil inside the back cover.